Good morning, everyone. So becher, if you're awake. I know you are. You're Peace Corps. You're always awake. Cheer, cheer. My task is, as the panel organizer, to introduce and make a couple of remarks. I want to define the word hambastigi. We're talking, I'm in this panel about cooperation and partnership. Various cooperations have occurred between Iran on a people-to-people basis in the past, as you well know, and if you don't, I'll remind you of a couple of them. The cooperation was, of course, at the government level, probably the most intimate in the Pahlavi period, when you and I in the 60s, if you're 60s people, and 70s, in Iran at the time of the Pahlavi regime. The cooperation at the people-to-people level was little noticed, but it was very active. For example, University of Pennsylvania maintained a very long-term status of agreement, and that's exactly what it was called, a status of agreement with University of Shiraz, then called the University of Shiraz. It will be changed to Pahlavi University in the middle of their cooperation, and then back to University of Shiraz with the coming of the Jamhuriya Islami, the Islamic Republic. The evolution of their cooperation, the University of Penn, was primarily for language purposes, sending graduate students to Shiraz for short periods of time. Soon became faculty exchanges, where faculty would arrive in Shiraz from the University of Pennsylvania or other universities from the United States and would teach specific courses in both the sciences and the humanities, particularly in the medical schools. Penn had a very good medical program, nursing program included, and they sent nurses to give instructions to Iranians in Shiraz at then Pahlavi University. It was called the Pahlavi program, by the way, that was its general term. It was subsidized in part by University of University of Pennsylvania, and then partly by the Pahlavi Foundation, which was, of course, attached to the family. The cooperation went very well, and a total of 15 different professors from Penn actually spent up to a year, a minimum of a year to 3 years in Shiraz as part of that cooperation through the 1960s into the 70s, and they left finally in 79. With the coming of the revolution, there was no need to continue. In fact, it was impossible to arrive the same way they did before on a regular standard basis by way of Tehran and making their way down to being met by someone in Shiraz. Other such people-to-people academic programs actually continued after the revolution, and again it was the University of Pennsylvania had a special program for graduate students, and they had to be graduate students from around the country of the United States who could go for a year in Tehran to the language school that was run by a private source, but the permission of the government was necessary. They got actually a one-year visa to come to spend time studying and learning Persian. They couldn't actually engage in any other university work with the University of Tehran, for example. They couldn't take courses in the University of Ariamer. They had to take it out of this special private language program. I actually ran into one of them, two of them, and in all places, Behesht Zahra, the major cemetery just south of Tehran. And I saw these two people speaking perfect Persian. I thought they were Iranian at first. Very casual dress in the wintertime. You couldn't tell actually what kind of clothes they wore. It was their shoes, of course, that gave them away. They wore very nice shoes and didn't have any givets with the broken backs. But they were visiting the graves in Behesht Zahra, and I had a long conversation with them, and in the program, as it was termed, was quite successful. But then again, it ran into rough waters about 2005 with the coming of Ahmadinejad and the regime, conservative regime. So people-to-people program at an academic level actually is quite old. And one of the suggestions we have here, a speaker from Georgetown University, is going to talk to you about how Georgetown University sets up such affiliations. When I was a director of international studies at Villanova University, I did the same thing that Craig is going to talk about. All of that would be very familiar, including with Arab universities, such as University in Jordan, the Lebanese American University in Lebanon, and several universities in the West Bank, Palestine occupied territories. These activities are rather simple to do, but of course there doesn't need to be government approval for any of them. Any of the ones I've mentioned, either the Jordan government nor the Lebanese government. And such arrangements are made with the Turkish government, and Georgetown has some of those programs, and perhaps Craig will indicate some of the downsides as well as the upsides of attaining such affiliations. But the affiliations, of course, it goes beyond that. We have also a speaker who's going to speak to Ed Martin about the Mennonite, Eastern Mennonite Church and the Eastern Mennonite University, which is in Pennsylvania, correct?
Virginia.
Oh, Virginia, sorry, our Southern brothers. The university had a center that was devoted to interfaith cooperation, and Ed Martin is going to speak to that in some detail about an ongoing program with, of all things, on religion. That is to say, Mennonite American families would spend time, of all places, in Cologne. Of course, it's appropriate to go to Cologne if you want to be in touch with seminarians and with the well-known theological school that was there. And he'll go into details about how that started and has been briefly halted at the moment, but they intend to continue it. So that's at the religious level, something that we might not think of as something attractive for the Iranians. Well, he'll give you details about how interesting it was for both Iranians and these Mennonite families. That have been more than 5 or 6 families that have been involved. Only families, not single people, according to the Iran restriction. That was it. It's the only thing they restricted. A desire to learn Persian would have helped, but the conversations are generally in English, with seminar fashion discussions on a daily to weekly basis about religion. We also have a speaker who's going to speak to in detail, and Peter Deacle will introduce him and speak to Stephen McInerney's project in Middle East democracy, which is based in Washington, D.C., and thus the reason why you only arrived today, as did Craig. They just bop in and bop out Arlington, places in the neighborhood, such as Annapolis. So we're delighted to have these speakers here. I wanted just to mention one further item, and then I'm going to quit and ask that Stephen and that is Peter come and talk to you about Stephen McInerney. That is this concept of hambastagi, which we all engaged in as Peace Corps volunteer. It was as natural as breathing. We were in our towns, working as teachers, working in villages, and working in community development and again in towns as a very natural thing to do. We were Iranians. Our supervisors were Iranian. Our colleagues were Persians and Iranian, and Persian was our language that we learned very quickly. And it wasn't an abnormal relationship, but we did know that we were actually supposed to be there like an aid official. Technically, Washington looked upon us as simply an extension of assistance, civilian, not military, assistance advisory program. The advisory program in Iran, of course, was Army Shmag, and that's the Army Military Mission and the Military Advisory Group called MAG. They operated again as advisors, but they were not volunteers. We were volunteers being paid by the Iranian government and partly by Peace Corps to help Iran. And therefore our identity was as Iranians. Therefore we had a director at one stage in the Iran 3 program. Iran 4 and 5 would all remember this man, Cleo Shook, who stayed only 6 months as a director in Tehran because he forgot this basic distinction. As volunteers, we were engaged in people-to-people hambastagi. We were not coming as advisors, a top-down paternalistic role played by the very nature of that structure. And we were not into that. We were into a brotherhood, sisterhood relationship with our colleagues. A much more intimate, a much more intensely intimate relationship. That's what hambastagi was about. We were basically, Peace Corps was not on an equal basis with our schools, not at all. But we as Peace Corps volunteers were on the same level, playing field as our colleagues. We were on a learning side of that playing field, of course. But in the partnership, there was an equality that was being sought. We were looking to make them as good as ourselves. We weren't looking for them with a special skill that would get them further into a career, perhaps. The workforce would become smarter with a language of English as their handy language. Of course, their skills learned from technicians would be add-on skills. But by and large, we always saw ourselves as nothing more than just Iranian Americans. And that's what we became. We became Iranized. I hope you enjoyed the process. I certainly did. Long-term friendships. I had a friend for 53 years, just died this summer. Kurdish brother, I call him Amir Hassanpour. And he taught me what friendship meant in Iranian terms. A little different than we had in the States. Much more intimate, much more personal, and of course lasting. So the questions of partnership does mean equality and working together. It means cooperation at people-to-people level. It means, of course, a transfer of personal skills, not just professional skills, and information. A wonderful book I always recommend to people to read is by Afshin Molavi, called The Soul of Iran. A book that if you don't know about, you should become acquainted with, because this is the first thing I would give somebody who knew nothing about Iran, absolutely nothing. Not a guidebook. It's a personal journey he makes, returning to Iran, going to nearly every major city and portion of Iran, and remembers it in a personal way. It's very Peace Corps-ish in that sense. He says at the end of this wonderful book, The Soul of Iran, he adds the following note, noting the attempts to the future. My own view is that Iranians are no different than other voters, he was talking about voting at the end, in the world. They don't like corruption, corrupt candidates, they want basic economic dignity, they want hope for the children's future, and yes, the majority want political freedoms too. This Iran journey to economic dignity, political freedom, and national independence does not end with the Ahmadinejad victory. He's writing about 2005. He ends by saying, a new generation of Islamic Republic elites, many of them from the Revolutionary Guard, slot themselves into positions of power on the back of Ahmadinejad's victory. They too will one day face their own protest vote, either at the ballot box or otherwise. And Iran's long journey to prosperity, independence, and freedom will plod on. And we were part of that journey. Well, we begin today talking about how we can intensify that, and now from the present to the future through Hambastagi. Peter Deacon.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for having us here today. Many of us work in higher education, or have worked there, and as such, we encounter that person-to-person, interpersonal exchange, which is very Peace Corps-like at times, I think. And today our panel will certainly represent some of the active and immediate expressions of it. I first met Stephen McInerney just about exactly 2 years ago. He chaired the panel on human rights in Iran, the commission co-chaired by Congressman Jim McGovern in the Capitol. It was a very eye-opening experience for me. I had just returned to the DC area from New England to live with my wife here in Maryland, and to encounter that immediate concern and interest of human rights in Iran was an eye-opener for sure. Stephen has a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Georgia Tech, and he also has a mathematics degree, a master's degree from Stanford University. After that, he studied Middle East studies at the university in Beirut, and also has Arabic studies from the University of Cairo. So he's got a background in the region. I don't want to forget, Jeanette, to say please write questions for submission so that we can kind of expedite the question and answer portion of our program. Stephen is going to talk today about the context that is introduced both by governments, politics, and events that impact and maybe facilitate or maybe complicate that kind of exchange and affiliation that Tom introduced among scholars. Just recently, in fact, a couple days ago, I've been associated with the Scholars at Risk program at NYU. I got their annual report, Free to Think. I would refer you to it. It is a worldwide survey of freedom of exchange of information and ideas and knowledge worldwide. Needless to say, the United States figures among those countries where this is at least confronted and conflicted to a degree. Iran, sadly, is among those institutions in the last year that is associated with this important issue of freedom to think and the free exchange of ideas and knowledge. But in that context, I don't want to take more time except to welcome Stephen, to thank you for being here, and we look forward to your remarks. Stephen McInerney.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Peter, for inviting me to speak with you all today. I'll just maybe start by saying a few words about the organization that I run, which Peter mentioned, which is based in Washington. We're called the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED. We were established a little more than 10 years ago. We were set up to be a voice in support of democratic principles, human rights, political reform, democracy across the Middle East and North Africa. We do research and analysis on political events in the Middle East and North Africa, and we generate policy recommendations for the U.S. government, and we do advocacy on behalf of those recommendations to try to strengthen U.S. support for democratic principles across the region. In addition, we also work directly with a lot of democracy advocates, political activists across the region, largely the Arab world, but also in Iran and Turkey. I'm going to talk a little bit initially about, this panel is supposed to be about partnerships and people-to-people exchanges. I'm talking a little bit about not only just our organization's work. We actually are not able to kind of engage and have some of the same kind of work on the ground in Iran that we do in a number of the Arab countries. But I'll also talk a little bit about some of the other work done by other organizations that focus on democracy and human rights. And there actually are quite a number of programs focused on supporting democracy and human rights in Iran. In general, these programs are relatively low profile. They're not necessarily advertised or talked about publicly a whole lot because in some cases it could endanger the participants. But I think there's some valuable and important programs, and I've had the opportunity to work with some very impressive Iranian political activists, very courageous Iranians who are working to try to bring about positive political change in their country. The scene, the community organizations that do try to support democracy and human rights in Iran, it is a little bit different from many other countries in the region. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to work on the ground. It's not the case. For example, our organization has a small office in Tunisia that we use to work in a number of Arab countries, and a lot of the other human rights and democracy organizations that are based here in the United States have offices around the world in different countries. Iran, is a place where unfortunately that's not possible, and increasingly. Also inside Iran, it has become more and more difficult for there to be indigenous Iranian human rights organizations or organizations that work publicly on democracy type issues. So Iran is an environment where a lot of this work is done quietly and a lot of it's done outside the country. But I do think that there is some important work done that does have a positive impact. This includes support for and training for Iranian journalists and media outlets. These are often based outside the country, but produce worthwhile and independent journalistic content that's disseminated into the country, either online or also sometimes through radio or television and satellite networks as well. In addition, there are training a lot of technology and internet freedom focused projects, and there's a lot of work done by American organizations to help Iranians to be able to express themselves and access content online, in some cases to circumvent censorship by the Iranian regime of the internet, and also to be able to kind of engage with the outside world more freely and securely using the internet. In addition, there are also a variety of kind of conferences and workshops that are held outside of Iran for Iranians to learn about things such as civic education, and also even advocacy. And there are Iranians who learn how to engage with, for example, with their parliamentarians and try to engage constructively despite the kind of difficulties in the closed environment there. Now, all of this kind of work, I think, is positive, and as I said, I've met a number of very impressive Iranians who are very appreciative of this kind of work that is done by U.S.-based organizations. But of course, there are numerous obstacles that many of you would be familiar with to doing this kind of work. And one of the questions that was put to me was, had the opportunities for this kind of work and engagement with Iranians, or including those Iranians that are pro-democracy, have those opportunities changed over the last few years in reaction to kind of U.S.-Iran relations and changes, most notably the nuclear deal, or even also the change in administration from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And in general, there haven't really been a lot of changes. A lot of the restrictions that have been in place are still in place. I think there was some hope prior to the Iran nuclear deal that if a deal agreement were reached, that it would present new opportunities for engagement with Iranians. The reality is, at least in the kind of work that our organization does and the kind of work that I was describing, that the opportunities haven't really changed that much. There are restrictions. Despite there being some sanctions relief, primarily on international multilateral sanctions, there are still, as you all know, bilateral sanctions in place that are a real obstacle. All organizations that work with Iranians have to receive licenses, be licensed by the U.S. Department of Treasury and OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which can be a difficult, cumbersome process. Of course, the Iranian government is not welcoming of this kind of activity, and there's sort of hostility and suspicion. And of course, there's sort of long-standing tensions in the bilateral relationship between the United States government and the Iranian government, which is a different situation from most of the governments in the Middle East and North Africa. Most of the other governments in the Middle East and North Africa are also non-democratic, repressive states, which don't necessarily welcome this kind of activity, but they are primarily kind of states that are U.S. allies, and therefore you have a different kind of context in which the U.S. Often provides assistance that some of the governments welcome, in addition to some of the things that they're less comfortable with. And then the last obstacle, or last thing that I'll mention to wrap up is, of course, there have also been, this year there have been these series of travel bans, and Iran has, there have been several iterations of a travel ban. The most recent one announced in September, in which Iran was one of 7 countries with restrictions on entry of their citizens to the United States. This also forces a lot of these programs, even if they're run by American organizations, it's more difficult to invite Iranians here than it is to invite people from other countries where the governments have a better relationship with the United States. But nonetheless, despite these obstacles, I think there's a lot of kind of positive work and positive engagement with Iranian citizens. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank Tom Ricks, as well as the Iran Peace Corps Association, for inviting me to be here with you. It's been a very interesting conference so far. And actually, when I was the age probably that many of you were when you were Peace Corps volunteers in Iran, I was a volunteer with the Mennonite Central Committee in Nepal. And many of my friends were actually American Peace Corps volunteers there, who really impressed me with the kind of work that they did. So today I speak from my experience first as the Mennonite Central Committee's Area Director for Central and Southern Asia, as well as the American Friends Service Committee's Quaker International Affairs Representative for Iran, and finally as the director of Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Interfaith Engagement. The involvement in Iran that I became part of and that Mennonites have been part of, and I should mention Mennonite Central Committee is the relief and development agency of the Mennonite churches in North America. This work began after a severe earthquake in June of 1990 in northwestern Iran in Gilan and Zanjan provinces. And we at Mennonite Central Committee decided we wanted to respond to that disaster for two reasons. One was the size of the disaster. There were an estimated 35,000 to 40,000 people that died in that severe earthquake. But also it was the geopolitics of that time. You know, the Berlin Wall had just come down, the Cold War was ending, and to some of us it appeared that in the eyes of some people here, including in our government, that political Islam was replacing communism as the enemy, and Tehran was replacing Moscow as the source of evil in the world. And we wanted to demonstrate that that we would respond to human need wherever it was, irrespective of political and religious differences. So we ended up providing some medical supplies to the Iranian Red Crescent Society, and I and several others made the first visit to Iran in January of 1991. I should mention that I never saw Iran the way that many of you did. And I kind of regret, my wife and I met and were married in Nepal, and one of the ways we considered traveling back was overland, and which would have taken us through Iran in 1973, which would have been, I'm sure, a much different view than it is today. But I'm glad I finally got involved and have really, really enjoyed it. So for the first, I would say from 1991 through 1997, the primary involvement that we had in Iran was a partnership with the Iranian Red Crescent Society. And I should mention that it is a very large, very able relief agency. Really didn't need the resources, the modest resources we could provide. But the Director General for International Affairs there, Mr. Sadruddin Saad, who happens to be the son of the Imam Musa Saad, from Lebanon, had a real vision of what it could show to people when a Christian humanitarian organization from North America was cooperating with an essentially Islamic humanitarian organization from Iran. And so for those years we had a very strong and supportive relationship with the Iranian Red Crescent Society. And that relationship led to our decision and ability to start a student exchange program. The wife of Mr. Saad came to Georgetown University, and it was about 1993, I think, as a visiting fellow in Georgetown's Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And Sadruddin came along, and while he was here, he visited the Iranian mission at the UN, and he kind of explained to the ambassador there the relationship of Mennonite Central Committee to the Iranian Red Crescent Society, and then he encouraged me to visit the mission, which I did. The ambassador at that time was Dr. Kamal Karazi, and we had, at Mennonite Central Committee, we had decided we wanted to find a way to have more direct people-to-people contact, and thought maybe a student exchange program might be a way to do that. Mennonite Central Committee during the Cold War had sent graduate students to study in Eastern European universities as a way to live among people in that part of the world and to learn to understand them and develop friendships. So we broached this idea with the UN mission, and the ambassador and one of his colleagues there, Dr. Sajadpour, who is now Deputy Foreign Minister, were very interested in it. And they said, give us a proposal, we'll take it to Iran and see what we can develop. So we sent them a short proposal. I knew that I wanted to send Americans to study Farsi language, to study Islam, to study Persian literature. I thought Iran would want to send engineers and scientists to study either in the United States or Canada. So I was really surprised when they said, no, they wanted to send some of their theology and philosophy students to study philosophy of religion. And so in 1997, my director and I went to Iran, and we went to Qom. It had been worked out by our colleagues, our friends at the mission and the Iranian government, that the host institution for this exchange would be the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute in Qom. So we went there and we spent some time and worked out an agreement with that institute for an exchange, which allowed for Americans to go there and to study, as I said, Farsi and study Islam in particular. And we offered that they could send their students to any place, either in the United States or Canada. They proposed McGill University in Montreal because they had some faculty who had studied there. And we proposed University of Waterloo because there was a large Mennonite community around there that could help to host them. And we compromised on University of Toronto and the Toronto School of Theology. And so under the program, 4 American couples in succession went to Iran and studied under the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute. Some of the women also studied at Jamiat Azhar, which is the women's seminary in Qom. And that went on from 1998 through, I think the last Americans left Iran in 2009, shortly before the presidential election. And I left my position at Mennonite Central Committee in 2007, so I wasn't as directly involved in it. And that part of the program kind of ended then. The last Iranian went back from Toronto, I believe, in 2010 with a PhD in philosophy of religion. There were 3 books that came out of the exchange program that were written by American students there. One is What is Iran? A primer on culture, politics, and religion, authored by Laurie Pierce, one of the students. Another one was Welcome to Iran, Christian Encounters with Shia Muslims by Evie and Wally Schellenberger. And the final one, 12 Infallible Men, the Imam and the Making of Shiism by Matthew Pierce. This was his PhD dissertation at Boston University, which was published by Harvard University Press. And it won this year a prize as an outstanding world book by the Iranian government. And he was supposed to go to receive his award in this spring, but because of the difficulties between our government and theirs and the travel ban, etc., he hasn't yet been able to go. But he will likely, they've promised that they will bring him there sometime to receive that award. Several other kinds of activities grew out of that student exchange program. One was a series of interfaith dialogue conferences. One of the professors in Canada who was involved in this thought it shouldn't only be students that benefit from this, there ought to be a way for faculty to benefit, and instituted a conference of interfaith dialogue. There have now been 6 of those, which have alternated between Canada and Qom. The 7th one is to be in March in Winnipeg, Canada, on the topic of ethics. We've also had a number of learning tours to Iran. I think Mennonite Central Committee sponsored 3 such learning tours that were hosted by the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute. There have also been several others hosted by the International Institute of Islamic Studies in Qom, and one involved students from both Eastern Mennonite University and Canadian Mennonite University on a 3-week tour which involved observing one of these interfaith dialogue conferences and a lot of travel, lectures on Islam, and one other aspect, or a couple other aspects involving Eastern Mennonite University. Our Center for Interfaith Engagement hosted an Iranian visiting professor for 3 years who taught courses on Islam and mysticism at Eastern Mennonite University. Our Center for Justice and Peace Building at the university has hosted at least 20, if not more, Iranian students who have come for a 6-week summer peace building institute, which the center has each summer. And 3 of those returned to do master's degrees in conflict transformation and peace building. And 2 came back for 1-year certificate programs related to restorative justice. So it's been a fascinating and unexpected involvement. And we're planning another learning tour for next April to be organized by this International Institute of Islamic Studies. The last one was in November, and both of those I was involved in co-leading. It's been wonderful to be involved in the way that I have. I regret that I didn't see it back before. I also regret that I have never had a chance to actually live in Iran and learn Farsi like so many of you know.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the Iranian Peace Corps Association for inviting me to participate in today's event, and I'd like to thank Tom as well. In thinking a bit more about the comments of my colleagues, partnerships have been the foundation for academia for as long as I can remember. Whether you think about that on a localized level or now on a multinational level, colleges and universities have really laid the foundation for academic inquiry and intercultural dialogue. And in this day and age, I think the idea of what is global education versus what is international education, colleges and universities are expanding what their collaborations are. They're thinking about how they can deliver educational content to their students while not always investing in their resources themselves, but how do they invest in people? And I think that's the critical piece to what a partnership is an investment in people. In doing that in an international context, I think that it has changed quite a bit over a number of years. It has developed from that which was much more transactional, either between an institution and institution serving kind of singular functions to things and relationships that now are much more transformational and strategic. And I know that I'll be speaking a bit more in terms of the context of Georgetown University. It's really fascinating to think about an institution as multidimensional as Georgetown and the role that it plays internationally, because for myself, and again, I represent the Office of Global Education, which is explicitly just undergraduate study abroad. And in my kingdom, I can't speak to student exchange between American universities and Iranian universities and American students and Iranian students. But what I can speak to is the challenges that we face and the successes that we face to try and establish these relationships and try and develop intercultural dialogue and academic dialogue between institutions. So I mentioned a bit about this idea of transformational and transactional partnerships, which I think is very important because in this day and age, an institution like Georgetown University is looking beyond this transaction of an exchange for a student for another student or an opportunity for another opportunity. And really the idea is to grow a more strategic partnership with institutions around the world. And I should say not even with just institutions, but the translation of a local entity, a local organization, Georgetown, for instance, as a Jesuit university that believes in social justice, we're heavily involved in the Washington, D.C. community. We're now looking at other types of experiential learning, not only for our students, but for students who are coming to Washington, D.C. to engage them with the Washington, D.C. culture. And we're looking to extrapolate that to our partnerships overseas. To do that is no small feat. And in order to really accommodate that and really accomplish that, we are now seeking more strategic partnerships, more transformational partnerships, where really our institution and our institutions overseas are in sync with one another in terms of goals and objectives. We really would like to have partnerships that formulate growth, that formulate development of students, that really benefit communities. But that can be, very, very challenging when you might not have a lot of face-to-face dialogue, when you might not have the same goals and objectives for your institution and the same mission and outcomes. So how do we do that? How do we really establish strategic transformational partnerships? We've seen a multitude of different partnership growth. My office represents only a couple of the types that are listed up on here, mostly in terms of student and faculty exchanges, and those can be either kind of bilateral, reciprocal exchanges. They can be actually in one-way exchanges, and I know that's hard to believe that those are actually exchanges, but it's more or less mobility. But our institution, in and of itself, carries many of these types of partnerships, and some of these partnerships were actually illustrated by my colleagues previous to my coming up here. Really, they're faculty to faculty, they're student for student, they're department for department, so they can be by focus, and they can be by function, as you can see, teaching and learning and internships and research opportunities. There is no limit to the types of partnerships that can be developed these days, provided that institutions can agree on a type of scope and involvement. In fact, what we're starting to see, and this is not a unique trend amongst the United States, experiential learning. Georgetown is a very traditional institution, has put a lot of their eggs in the basket of academic structures, academic experiences. But our students now are seeking opportunities that help them translate their academic skill set into a career skill set. So internships, research opportunities, community engagement. We have not historically sought out those types of opportunities in our overseas partnerships, but now we're starting to do that. And so we're having to think about how we can grow the dimensions of our partnerships in order to accommodate a greater number of experiences. So again, a little bit more about Georgetown University. We have 10 schools that are undergraduate and graduate, professional schools, a law center, a medical center, over 17,000 students. That's roughly 7,000 undergraduate students, 10,000 graduate students, over 48 undergraduate degree programs, 2,000 academic staff, 1,500 professional staff, and a significant course catalog. So how would I describe our partnerships? That is a very tricky question, actually. Our partnerships can be largely dictated by administrative and financial models, unfortunately, and not always through mission and in terms of the betterment of the person-to-person contact. And those are some unfortunate challenges that we face. We can be limited in terms of our internationalization efforts because we are a very large decentralized institution. And I know that we might not be large in the scope relative to, say, some public land grant institutions, but we are an extremely complex organization, and that can make opportunities for partnerships to be a bit more challenging. My office might seek out partnerships that are different than our graduate programs, that are different than the types of partnerships that our faculty and research-based centers are seeking out. And I think at times they can be quite in conflict. So in terms of undergraduate student mobility, again, that's my wheelbarrow. bilateral student exchanges, which aren't necessarily reciprocal. This is a very difficult conversation to have with some of our overseas exchange partners. There is an actual financial transaction at our institution whereby an outbound study abroad student will pay Georgetown tuition, and we have to use that tuition to pay for the incoming exchange student. And unfortunately, there are more costs associated with an incoming exchange student than there are funds that we receive from the outbound study abroad student. So that means that we cannot have a reciprocal exchange with our partners overseas. We must actually come up with a ratio of maybe 2 outbound students for every 1 inbound student to help offset those costs. So as you can imagine, that is a very difficult conversation to have with a partner, a potential partner overseas, when your ideal is to come on an even playing field. You really want to have a very mutual and respectful relationship. That is a very difficult conversation to have right from the get-go. We do have other types of programs that are one way, but again, if we look at kind of higher education models, the financial model for higher education in the United States can be a complex one relative to other financial models for higher education around the world, and it does develop some inequities. These are a few other challenges that we face in terms of our student partnerships. Student expectations, difficulty in facilitating campus-wide conversations, academic standards, and the perception of academic standards. Student support needs, what can be a greater challenge. So again, I mentioned a little bit about transformational partnerships, which I think are just another word for strategic partnerships. And really, these are not so difficult of concepts to grasp. The ultimate goal is partnership expansion, and I believe Ed spoke a little bit more about some concepts of partnership expansion, where you might start with student mobility, student exchange, and it might lead to faculty research opportunities, internship opportunities, any number of those types of partnerships. But the hope is that institutions will come face to face, that they'll be able to agree upon an outcome that is mutual to both organizations, and that their partnership will blossom under that. I mentioned the challenges that we face institutionally. Again, the root for all of this is student outcomes and student experiences, but the challenges can be significant with regards to how we manage and how we develop. And our hope is that we find organizations that understand and respect those challenges, but are willing to overcome those challenges with us so that we can work for a fruitful partnership amongst organizations.
Very good.
Now it's truly your turn to interact with the panel. Are there any questions in advance that people have submitted? Please.
Yeah, could you send a copy of your PowerPoint, gentlemen from Georgetown, if we give you our email?
I believe it's going to be routed through the conference
School
committee,
website?
my understanding.
All right, thank you.
That's right. Please.
Yes, I have a question about the whole idea of what you're talking about. As to, this is a country that we are in, which has a democracy, or what we call a democracy. And it's sort of a bit suspect when you look at what we're doing and what some of the other countries are doing, and particularly in the Middle East, what we've done, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, and places like this. And I just wonder, like a couple of years ago, I was in Iran, and some very sophisticated guys were questioning the U.S. democracy and saying versus Iran, in which they felt that the U.S. democracy is just driven by money, and whereas their democracy is more people. And so it's not like we have a magic recipe for the rest of the world. And the other thing is, I'm sort of wondering about the Peace Corps and what it's trying to do at this point in time. Is it trying to be the front edge or part of this movement of sort of the Trump organization? This type of thing that's going on. And it raises real questions in my mind.
Philip, that's very timely. I was speaking with our speakers before the program, and particularly with Stephen in terms of his project on Middle East democracy. What does that mean not only here, but to the world? I don't know, Stephen, if you feel comfortable talking first to Philip's point.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your question. Certainly, there are lots of challenges to democracy here in the United States and most places around the world. Our organization and most of the other organizations in our field that we work with are not trying to sort of export any American model of democracy. I mean, our belief is that there are sort of universal democratic principles that are represented in some documents, including the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and that there's a whole spectrum of the degree to which citizens of different countries have these rights protected, including protected by their government as well as protected by international agreements. And there's certainly questions to be raised about the quality of democracy here at home. But nonetheless, I think that just, I think, personally, I do think that there's concerns and there's some erosion of some democratic institutions to some degree, but nonetheless, I think we do enjoy rights and freedoms here that a lot of people in many other countries, including Iran, do not. We do work, our organization and many of the other organizations that are carrying out the programs I described do work with Iranian citizens, and we try to have be supportive of their efforts, not to tell them what they should be doing. But there are citizens that are wanting to try to bring about positive change, including political reforms, or wanting to try to encourage other Iranian citizens to be more engaged in the political process and to have more of a voice in their country. And they are very welcoming and appreciative of support that can be provided by those outside. I do think it's very important to kind of follow their lead and to support their efforts, not to kind of direct or try to export anything to them.
I would also say, Ed, you and I were talking about the campus culture and the tolerance here in the academy for difference of opinion and for dialogue. So it relates not only to us abroad, but also us at home interacting. Tom, you had a question for us?
No, I had comments made following up on this first question. Because behind your question is a very, very good issue. That is, what are we doing, meaning the United States government? But this panel and this organization doesn't necessarily represent Peace Corps. We call ourselves Peace Corps Iran Associates. But there are various people who are in this organization who would like to work closely with the National Association. There are others, including myself, who are far more interested in what Peace Corps volunteers did, and that we work at the grassroots level, regardless of our government's programs. But keeping in mind that those programs have a larger voice than our voice, that in fact our government is pursuing and has for some time pursuing ways of intruding into countries by way of mechanisms like this. I think this, what Stephen was saying is that's not necessarily what he's interested in and his group. But you're touching a very important political question. It is, in a sense, what can the Peace Corps volunteers who have been in Iran in a very undemocratic period do today in an equally, if not more, undemocratic period? And one of the answers is that we work more directly with Iranians in the way that, in fact, has been shown by the Mennonites in going to Iran to meet needs. And that's exactly what we were trying to do, meet needs. And the meeting of needs is the first order of business. What are they interested in? Well, the Mennonites thought they might be interested in one thing. they clearly told him we were interested in talking about religion. And that led to the poem Doorway. And fantastic experiences now have produced some interesting books. I'm going to answer a couple of questions that are in the hand.
Jackie?
I'll take the microphone. Thank you. Oh, Skip, can you help with the microphone, carrying it around? I don't even know where Skip is. I'll do it after I ask my question. So I have noticed that many Americans who did not serve in the Peace Corps are fairly sophisticated about knowing that the Iranian people are friendly towards Americans. And so where I live in Portland, a lot of people are looking at what can we do person to person to reach out to the Iranian people. And we have a project going to hopefully create a sister city relationship between Portland and Shiraz. And it's very challenging to even connect with anybody in Shiraz. So right now we're organizing on the Portland side because it's a complex, there are a lot of rules and restrictions or just things you have to do to be a sister city in Portland, in any American city. So we're working on that. It occurs to me that trust is one of the main reasons we're having trouble getting started. And so my question to you, Ed, is how do you obviously have that trust on the Iranian side, and I'm wondering how we can build that with our Sister City project.
Well, I think one of the things that probably helped develop the trust is we were very open, we didn't try to hide anything. I mean, the first visit we made to Iran, we were very clear that we were there, we were representing the humanitarian organization of a church, and that our desire to serve in a humanitarian way was a result of our Christian faith, and I think that it was important to be very open, and I think we've tried to do that in everything we've done. It's also very important, obviously, to show very real respect for the people with whom you're interacting. And certainly we've tried to do that, and I hope that's been experienced.
Places for people going to other universities, Georgetown,
Well, yeah, we've had, like I mentioned, some of the students went to the Toronto School of Theology, but I've also been involved with helping people. We had an ecumenical delegation that visited Iran in 2007, and one of our hosts there was a professor at a university in Tehran, and he had an interest in the philosophy of religion, and in particular, professor at Notre Dame University. And we were able to help him come to Notre Dame for one summer to work with him, and then Notre Dame invited him back several other times. He's been there. He was there for a full year sabbatical. He's been there 2 other times to teach a course on kind of comparing Catholic theology with Shia theology. There was this person that went to Georgetown, although we were involved. One of the students that did a master's degree at Eastern Mennonite University is now doing a PhD at Georgetown. Really fine Iranian person. So yeah, we've tried to do what we can to facilitate academic interaction between faculty members as well as students.
Please. The microphone will find you. Incidentally, we have extended the question session until 11:45, if needed.
I really appreciate the Peace Corps Iran Association focusing on the idea of exchanges. And it seems to me we really need to take a long view and assume that for the foreseeable future, our 2 governments are not going to be really helpful on this score. So what are the other roots we should really be focusing on. I think the example of the Mennonites is really sterling for us in terms of, as Jackie said, developing trust and having a real two-way exchange. And the example you gave of sister cities, I happened to, this was 10 years ago, talk with some people about something like that. And one of the examples that came up was not just the whole spectrum of sister city to sister city, but finding a particular area where two cities can share something. And the example that I learned at that time was two cities that had needs in the area of fire prevention and fire departments, including exchanging expertise and equipment and all kinds of things, and then getting people together. So you get very specific. The other idea I'd like to put forward is, because it's so difficult for Iranians to come here now, and in some cases for us to go there, why not focus on some third country locations? You used Canada for the Mennonites, but think of a country where both Iran and the US might have some interest and some expertise to work together and come up with a joint project and then recruit people from both sides who can contribute.
Could I mention in terms of that comment that working with and through NGOs may be more immediately effective than through government agencies themselves. For example, the National Peace Corps Association has a new agreement with the Rotary International, I believe. And those kinds of organizations can promote people-to-people significance, I think. We've been told we will have time for one or two more questions.
I remember a lot more than that, but not a time.
I'm reminded, one at a time.
Just an observation. I was asked yesterday by someone when I was in the Peace Corps what kind of conversations we had with our Iranian friends about our governments. And I said I noticed that when they were talking about their own government, and this is the 67, 69 period, they were very cautious about what they said about their own government. But after the Peace Corps, I stayed on and worked in Tehran at an engineering company, and I was working with quite a few people who were U.S. educated. And we got to be good friends, and we talk about governmental things. And I noticed those people were very open about what they had to say about their government and about our government. We had some very open discussions among friends. And so I think the programs that we're talking about are very important. If we're going to be honest with one another and understand what's really going on, I think these kinds of programs are extremely important.
In that regard, let me just say that Craig probably faces this. When our undergraduates go abroad, it's paramount, but also somewhat lacking, that they understand the U.S. government positions. It's far more likely that their hosts in Iran and around the world know more about the situation.
Stephen? There's another.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let's get into questions.
Another question. This is directed to Steve. Bill Beeman, who is a PCIA member, has asked the advocacy committee to work on getting scholar exchanges and the licensing with OFAC. It seems very daunting to us. Do you have contacts there, or should we kind of work more closely with your organization to work on that?
Any more questions?
Sure. So I'd be happy to follow up with you and try to help connect you with people and resources that they can help on that front. It is kind of daunting and challenging. Also, just responding on your comment, and as well, kind of coming back with your first question, on the kind of talking with Iranians about their government and their concerns and frustration, and also their frustrations with our own government here. I mean, I do think that's an important sort of part of the trust building process. I mean, when I travel in the Middle East and North Africa, or other my colleagues from our organization, if we're introducing ourselves to people in the region, and they know that we're coming from Washington, that you know, there's often an initial assumption that we're working on behalf of the United States government or the CIA or something along these lines. Our organization was actually established in 2004, 2005, kind of as a response to what our founders saw as very unhelpful, misguided policies in the region, including the war in Iraq. And our organization was sort of, we're in Washington so that we can try to change U.S. policy toward the region. And I think it's an important part of building trust with Iranians or Arab citizens in the region is kind of demonstrating that and making that clear, and kind of demonstrating our record of criticism of U.S. policies, criticisms that they often share, opens the door for them kind of wanting to partner with us in different ways.
Yeah, get more questions.
I have a simple question. What is the sandwich program?
Something to eat.
Before lunch, you mean?
I can see someone's hungry. So a sandwich program is essentially where you may start at one university, you may take an interlude of a year or 2 years at another institution, and then come back to return to your home institution. So it would be, you might see this sometimes in engineering programs for a school that doesn't have a strong engineering program, whereby a student might get a foundation in 1 year at their home institution, go for 2 years somewhere else to get some more advanced either math, science, and then return back home for a capstone or something like that. So that's a sandwich program. Does that make sense?
I wanted to know too. Thank you.
Two more.
It's probably very difficult to talk about strategies under the current sort of irrational idea of the moment tweet stuff going on right now. But I'm just wondering if you can share any sort of larger, learning experience of the past year, or things that we might think about as strategies or ways to cope with the current situation.
More questions?
Well, no, can I just say, in terms of POMED, they have regional partners, if you will, and working with them rather than through government agencies is probably more productive and maybe toward the road of trust and respect that seems to be a little fragile.
Just a comment about the Shiraz program. Maybe you should start really simply and do a garden group exchange, since Shiraz is built as the City of Roses, or Portland is, and Shiraz has gardens. Maybe start with something simple like that, as an exchange of gardens and landscape, etc. And it's good to know that even after 40 years, that some Americans are still considered CIA. Because I'm sure many volunteers like myself were considered CIA or something like that. Anyway, this is, the question is really, in these exchange attempts, as volunteers we went through social customs and understanding how to live in a completely different world from the American world. And so one question is that ongoing now? Is there a training in the social mores, social customs of the Iranian people, of how they interface with each other, how they act with foreigners, guests, etc.? And are any subjects, any topics off subject? I remember when I was doing outside Peace Corps work and teaching, you never discussed politics, kind of thing. So social customs, mores, and topics off subjects in exchanges.
does somebody, I have a comment, but
Go ahead.
when I was employed, we had an initiative to educate Afghan women. It was the first of its kind in the U.S., and it was immediately after the current crisis started. So that was fine. The Afghan women were hardly prepared for American culture. They were brought to our New England campus and housed and there for 4 years. But the campus was no readier to accommodate them in terms of a cultural understanding. And it began a global program, much like Craig's, I think, to prepare us to receive them and to exchange with them. I think that's very needful everywhere. Tom, you were going to...
I had a comment I wanted to make to follow up on a couple of the questions, but it's really a challenge. How many of you live near or actually are in a city that has a major university, American university? Nearly half, maybe more than half the people here. I'm going to give you a challenge. Our universities are multi-level, have many different schools and skills that they teach. Why can't you take it on yourself to approach someone at the university and suggest they work with Iran on, and you fill in the blank. Iran is in desperate need of understanding better hydrology, water usage. They have run into problems because of the activities, mainly the Pasdaran, and the creation of this separate economic military unit within Iran. It's an army within an army, it's an economy within an economy. Just like the Turkish military has done in Turkey, the Pasdaran have developed their own economy, their own banking systems, and their own partners with industry. Irregardless of guidelines and problems of environment, they have given out license after license to private industries to open up around the lake area where water is needed, and they're draining the lakes. Like Lake Reza, Lake Urmia is half a desert. I've seen it. It actually is strange to see a lake that I crossed as a Peace Corps volunteer with a ferry boat. I couldn't walk across it, but there's a levee now that cuts it right in half. One half is a desert, the other half is barely becoming a desert. And it's because the water is being licensed off to private industries through this parallel economic function of the Pasdars. And they have they have a lot of power and actually work out beside against the interests of the country with little restrictions. Talk about regulations. There are no regulations for the Pasdars. They do what they do. So Iran has faced some major issues of hydrology. I never saw the living river, Zianderud, which is of course in Isfahan, dry. In fact, the last time I was in Iran in 2011, there was no water passing through the wonderful bridges that cross that invisible river, because the water is being drawn down upstream away from the river sources and being utilized in the mountain passes where the water can be readily tapped by these Pasdar operations and industrialization development programs that the government approves of. There's other things. Pollution is a major issue that Iran faces. One can see these needs just by clicking on any kind of Googling or Wikipedia and find out what are Iran's needs, and begin to offer the universities a chance in challenging them. Have you ever thought of starting relationships with, and look at the universities, there are 170 universities in Iran. You can't run out of universities in every major city. And major cities are no longer 300,000, they're 3 million. Isfahan is over 3 million. And it's impossible to see the end of Isfahan as you come from Shiraz into Isfahan. You cross that hill and spread before you will be Isfahan. You can't see the end of the city of Isfahan any longer as we could 50 years ago. So I offer that as a challenge to all of you. So many of you actually are near universities, major universities. This is one way as individuals you could begin building these ties at the university level. And it is possible to get in touch with Iranian universities. I always Skype with friends in Iran. You can Skype people, you can get in through email, and actually telephones. Iran is not behind an iron curtain, the impression we get from our government that you can't get into Iran, you can't get in touch with Iran. It's not true. It's not isolated. It's possible to build programs. The Mennonite Project is one very good example of how that happened. right through this period when Iran has been going through such difficult times, and we as well. So I think that it's really a very good challenge to keep in mind, and it's doable. As to Shiraz, there's no reason why. If you wish me to do this, I'd be glad to get in touch with the principal people of the University of Pennsylvania and ask them to revive the Shiraz Penn program. No reason why. I'm sure they will be receptive on this side, and perhaps even Shiraz. So I'm happy to do that. Jackie, if that's an initiative, I'll take that as a project, just to help you with the city to city. The garden was really wonderful, the City of Roses. And I had a personal interest. I got in prison. I was thrown in jail for a day in the City of Roses for working as a trainer in the Peace Corps project at Reed College. Anybody from 12 will know that happened. And I was got involved in driving a school bus for Reed College, because I drove buses before when I was at Notre Dame. I didn't drive through a city that didn't have stop signs. And I got hit by a car and ended up in court. The judge said I was guilty immediately when I said I was from Reed College. They don't have a good relationship with the City of Roses. The mayor of the City of Roses came through checking out the jail, and I was in prison. And I asked him if he could improve the menu. So it's a very funny experience with the City of Roses, with the City of Gardens. That suggestion made by an earlier person while you were out of the room, Jackie, I thought was excellent. More questions?
When you visit Jonathan Pearson and Ann Baker at the NPCA table this afternoon, you'll learn that beyond country affiliates, NPCA has a number of cause-related enterprises to engage us, whether it's refugee support, education of women, and other programs. So you'll learn more about how we can impact Iran-American relationships beyond the country, too. Other questions?
Yes, I have a statement to make that sometimes the introduction comes from the other side. I ran across a professor at Creighton University at the business school who is a philosopher with a subspecialty in ethics, who attended a sort of a worldwide philosophy meeting and was invited by an Iranian professor to come there and spend some time with his students, etc., and give some talks. Now, it so happens that he was a Christian, and so you can't. There's a lot more interconnection than you realize that really does happen.
Good comment.
Any more? One. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Quickly. I think one of the requirements for volunteer is to be curious. I think that's one that drove me into, besides the Vietnam War. And I think that I was at the DC gathering with a lot of people. This is a smaller group. And I was itching to ask this question. This was during the primaries. How many people in this room would vote for Donald Trump? And they were saying, Peace Corps, you can't do that. But I think in our little group, which is hopefully expanding, and the fact that we have this program relative to other countries that's pretty doggone strong from what I've learned, I'm glad I came. That begs a question, and I don't know whether you permit that, but I think I'd ask the question, how many people here would vote for Donald Trump? And I don't think there'd be a hand raised, but I'm just curious.
I think part of being an NPCA member and RPCV is community engagement, however that works.
I'd just like to say, well, one of the things I do as volunteer is I mentor one of our high schools in Tulsa on their first robotics program. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a very international program. Every year at the championships, we get teams in from China, Russia, European countries, Africa, South America, Australia. The only representation from the Middle East is usually a couple of teams from Israel. And so I suggested about 2 years ago that maybe we ought to look at developing a team from Iran, and very well educated. And I got a very negative response about it. No, we can't do that. Man, I would like to really establish a contact where maybe we could start talking about that, getting a couple of Iranian high schools involved in a program like this. It's a very tough competition. It's very sophisticated. Oh, and you might, I don't have the microphone, you might remember last year, there was an article that hit the newspapers. There was a team. Last year, there was a team, an all-girl team from Afghanistan that made it to the championships. So it's a great international program.
Actually, I want to make an announcement at the close, I'll assume we're close to the close of this session. The afternoon session, of course, will begin at 1, I believe. Is that correct? But while you're having lunch, if you would please, you'll have time to look at a book that Shala Dori Kamali has brought with pictures, and I think maybe the pictures will also be put up on the screen. We thank her. Now, quite importantly, yesterday there was a sense of the people gathered here that we put together a resolution in support of the nuclear agreement. We have the advisory, the advocacy committee, writing team has drafted a very simple and elegant statement in support, which has been reviewed and approved by the board here this morning. Copies of that statement are on the advocacy table at the corner. It's the table right in back of, between the two lights. Pick up a copy, look it over. We're going to come back to you after lunch and ask again for a sense that this is the consensus of the group here in conjunction with the board approval, that we make this statement public, provide it to our members outside of this room, make it available to the people we met with yesterday, the Atlantic Council, NIAC, and find any way we can to use it in speaking with our congressional representatives, etc. So, yeah, and Doug will, it'll be up on our media, on our website and Facebook. And you can put it on your personal, yes, Facebook, however you can get the word out, but we want to make sure that you've seen it and we have your approval.
Do you want us to sign it?
We haven't set it up that way. I would suggest that you simply use it to pass around. I mean, it isn't set up as a signing petition or anything like that. If you want, we could put up a sheet that documents your approval, and we could put that over at the advocacy table as well. And I think that, oh yes, Kathleen wanted to mention, we have other materials that in support of the nuclear agreement, including a letter that we received from Dianne Feinstein that makes a good, solid argument for our supporting the diplomacy that brought this agreement to us. The final thing I want to say is that, I guess I've covered pretty much everything. So are there any further questions about this process with the resolution? Yeah.
Does this not be the official policy of the organization?
Well, as I said yesterday, there's already been a statement issued, approved by the board several months ago, longer than that actually, in support of the nuclear agreement. So this is just an affirmation of, I would say, policy that we've already adopted.
So are you saying that we shouldn't necessarily say this is what our organization, this is the statement our organization put together as a, as an addenda that we sent in with the letter to Congress.
How, you're asking how to phrase it. I would use the wording, go ahead, Kathleen. This is a,
Parliamentary-wise, I would suggest that it's not the sense, that's a kind of a weak term. I would say this is the consensus of this. I would say that if you agree, we would maybe hands up or hands not, you know, kind of, if you look at it, maybe we could take kind of a minute or so afterwards. Is this a consensus of this group? Doesn't mean you agree with every word, but you can live with it, is what consensus means. And so that's, I think that's a better parliamentary term, not just the sense, but the consensus.
Kathleen, and I think my good co-chair is suggesting that we formally conclude this session in order to move onward. Okay. So I want to thank our panelists for taking time. And thank you all for coming. I know you're hungry, and that resolution